pleasure of starting an industry conversation that really picks up on the themes that we heard from Secretary Zinke and Secretary Perry on infrastructure and modernization. I'd like to start by introducing the panelists for you, and then we will have a moderated discussion for about 30-40 minutes, and then there'll be about 15-20 minutes for discussion with all of you. So please get your questions ready. We want to make sure that we have an interactive time with all of you, and really we've got an expert panel here. So without further ado, let me introduce them to you. First, we have Jason Burwen. He is the Policy and Advocacy Director of the Energy Storage Association. He leads the industry's state, federal, and RTO ISO engagements, so Regional Transmission Organization engagements. Very important role, as we heard from the previous panel. Prior to that, he was the Associate Director for Energy Innovation at the Bipartisan Policy Center, where he directed research and advocacy on U.S. energy R&D, tax policy, as well as other issues. Next, we will hear from Pierce Norton. He is the President and Chief Executive Officer of One Gas and a member of the One Gas Board of Directors. He began his natural gas career with Delhi Gas Pipeline, a subsidiary of Texas Oil and Gas Corporation. He later worked for American Oil and Gas, KN Energy, Bear Paw Energy, and prior to One Gas becoming a standalone publicly traded company from One Oak Inc., he served as the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer for One Oak and One Oak Partners. And he's the very proud chair of the American Gas Association's Board of Directors. Third, we'll hear from Dylan Reed, Senior Associate for Federal and State Policy at the Advanced Energy Economy. Dylan leads their federal congressional affairs. He also is the lead advocate for a number of states, and I personally have had the pleasure of working with him in a few of those states. So Dylan, great to have you. Then finally, Charlie Riedl, Vice President at the Natural Gas Supply Association, and he also serves as the Executive Director for the Center for LNG. He works with CLNG member companies, regulators, legislators, and other key stakeholders to provide credible and educational information about the economic and environmental benefits of LNG. Prior to joining CLNG, Charlie worked at the American Natural Gas Alliance, or ANGA, and at a major exploration and production company in various roles. So really, we have an expert panel here to cover all issues related to infrastructure and how do we modernize them in a cost-effective and efficient manner to meet the needs going forward. So to start the panel, I wanted to give everybody an opportunity to take a little more time to introduce themselves and talk about their role in the industry, but also share how they fit into the infrastructure conversation. So I think I'm just going to start with Charlie, and we'll just go down the line if that would work. And again, please talk a little bit more about CLNG Sure. and how you're looking at infrastructure issues at a high level.
Thanks, Lisa. So good morning, everyone, and I'd also like to express gratitude and excitement to be here this morning and talking a little bit about the Center for Liquefied Natural Gas and who we are and what we do, but also for being a part of this and working with CRES to try to bring this event together. So CLNG is, as Lisa mentioned, a group of, we're a trade association, and I represent, as part of my duties, is talking to folks like you about the liquefied natural gas export business and what that actually means. And as I think about it from an infrastructure standpoint, as Lisa was sort of alluding to, sort of the last piece of infrastructure as you think about it here in the United States. So some of the other panelists here will talk a little bit about the pipeline and natural gas supply, but we rely on that infrastructure as it relates to LNG exports, obviously every day, in order to get the gas delivered to liquefying facility and then being able to load that LNG onto a vessel and carry it out of the U.S. As Secretary Perry and Zinke alluded to, the opportunity in the United States is a big one right now for LNG. And it's not just domestically that as we think about infrastructure, but it's also on the receiving end in the countries that are looking to import natural gas out from the United States into their country to use it to displace Secretary Perry talked about in Europe, old or dirty energy facilities and electricity facilities in other countries. As those facilities are retiring, we think about the ability to move natural gas from the U.S. to those facilities. And so it's not just infrastructure here in the United States that we're talking about, but it's also infrastructure in those developing countries that are looking to implement natural gas. And so part of my responsibility and part of what we're trying to do at CLNG is educate not only here domestically about what LNG could provide for those countries, also what LNG could provide for the United States in terms of job creation, in terms of the benefits from a tax standpoint here in the U.S., but also environmentally as countries are looking to try to bring a cleaner fuel into their countries. You know, you think about sort of from a bigger standpoint, something like 16% of the world still doesn't have electricity. So, you know, that's over 1 billion people. More than 1 billion people still don't have a clean source of energy to cook with. So when we talk about the opportunity that U.S. gas represents from an environmental standpoint and also from a quality of life standpoint, it's an emerging opportunity that we've got one facility currently in operation in the lower 48 that's exporting natural gas. We've got another that's set to come online later this year, and then a few more next year as sort of the first wave of LNG as it arrives here for operational facilities. And it's interesting, you juxtapose that against just a few years ago, 5-6 years ago, we were talking about still importing natural gas. We became a net exporter earlier this year. So the opportunity is upon us. I think that it is an exciting time to be talking about the benefits that natural gas can bring, both here domestically and abroad. And like I said, I'm excited to be a part of the discussion this morning.
Great, thank you. Jason?
So thank you again, Lisa, to Chris for putting on this National Clean Energy Week Symposium. I'm Jason Burwen with the Energy Storage Association. We have been around for actually 27 years, which most people don't realize. Started as a utility battery technology group and have grown into a diverse set of stakeholders: utilities, independent power producers, project developers, technology manufacturers of batteries, flywheels, compressed air energy storage, thermal storage, and other technologies. The entire value chain is a part of our over 150 members here in the United States. And I'll try to give as brief an overview of what we're talking about when we talk about energy storage. Obviously, this is an exciting area, one that people are very charged up about. Sorry, I had to put that in there. And yes, a laugh. And the key thing here is that what energy storage is doing as a part of infrastructure is it's moving electricity and energy across time. Wires move across space. Energy storage moves it across time. And that's really important because in our energy system, particularly electricity, you have to match supply and demand at every given moment, right? So the ability to move that to exactly when and occasionally where you need it at the exact moment affords an enormous amount of operational capabilities in your electric system. And that's why this is a key part of modernizing the energy infrastructure of the United States. So I think the 4 main ways you're seeing energy storage be included into the energy infrastructure of the United States is: first, it is complementing and occasionally substituting for your conventional electric infrastructure, for your wires. So you're seeing particularly lots of utilities and transmission owners looking at this asset as a part of their base. Because, for example, if you're building a long rural feeder and you have some real reliability issues on there, it can be very expensive to upgrade it. Or you could put a battery on the end of that line and deal with, say, some of the reliability issues at a much lower cost and provide continuity of service to those communities. Indeed, we're seeing utilities like AEP proposing to do this in Texas, Rocky Mountain Power doing this in Utah. Across the country, a lot of different utilities thinking about life extension of these infrastructures using energy storage. And I think that's going to be something you're going to see more and more of. I think the most exciting project we've seen recently is in Arizona, where APS has now put batteries on their distribution system as part of deferring upgrades to that system. And that leads us to sort of point 2 for how it's a part of the infrastructure. It's enabling more consumer choice and allowing greater integration of distributed energy resources onto our electric grids. So what happens is when you put energy storage into your distribution grid, you're increasing the hosting capacity, the ability to integrate more rooftop solar, electric vehicles, load control assets, and other things that can provide those local energy resources. So you're not as dependent, perhaps, on the wires in a given locality to provide the needs of that community. And that's, for example, I mentioned the Arizona APS case, but also you're seeing that in places as diverse as New York. You're seeing that in utilities like Southern California Edison. And this is, I think, going to be, again, a key part of how our infrastructure develops with energy storage. The third way it's being incorporated is as part of resilience, and particularly as a response to emergency conditions. So when the Aliso Canyon gas storage facility in Southern California failed unexpectedly, energy storage at very bulk scales was deployed in record time, less than 6 months from contract approval to online and in service, for over 80 megawatts of battery storage facilities to make up those capacity shortfalls and ensure there would not be brownouts or rolling blackouts in Southern California. That's just-in-time capacity. I don't think we've ever seen that really happen before, and this is, again, changing the paradigm of what's possible in the United States. Of course, resilience also means things like on-site backup power. I think this is a particularly critical part of the conversation right now as we see folks riding through extreme events like hurricanes. And watching folks who, for example, have solar plus storage be able to actually continue the service to their homes or to their businesses through those different events. So I think that's going to be also a critical part of this. And related to that is reducing the vulnerability of local communities and giving them local control. So that's the fourth way. So you're seeing particularly munis and co-ops who are putting energy storage into their systems so that they're not totally at the whim of the larger systems they're connected to, and have the ability to reduce their vulnerability to larger shocks and provide backup for their emergency responders and services. You've got folks like the town of Sterling, Massachusetts, who are reducing their costs to being a part of their regional grid while providing their fire and police departments backup power. You're seeing Kotzebue, Alaska, be a completely off-grid community that uses batteries as part of a suite of technologies to have reliable electric service even though they don't have a grid connection. And on and on. You have these different communities who are using it for these purposes. So I think those are really the four ways you're seeing energy storage a part of the modernizing electric infrastructure of the United States. I think I'll save my conversation for what we do about that for later in the conversation.
Great, thank you. Dylan.
Thank you, Lisa. And I'll also say thanks to Team CREZ for guiding us through this on this whole week, and all the steering committee members. Advanced Energy Economy is really pleased to be a member of this effort this week. But AEE, we're a national business association of advanced energy technology, and I think we're unique when it comes to energy groups in that we represent over 50 different advanced energy technologies, and many of those have been referenced today, whether battery storage or natural gas, small modular reactors, solar, wind, but many others: energy efficiency, demand response, smart grid technologies, and all the technologies that are really advancing and modernizing our energy system today. And when you look at it from that diverse set of technologies, over 50 different technologies, and all the companies that are deploying that, it really does tie in quite well into how we view around infrastructure and modernization policy, and that how we see the energy system moving forward is one in which you're using a diverse set of technologies, all of these variety of technologies that are moving forward our energy system. And I think the way we define infrastructure within that then becomes a broad definition. How are you going to be moving forward? In the traditional sense, I think we standardly think about poles and wires and how we're going to be doing that, which is incredibly important. And I think Secretary Perry mentioned that today, and the development in Texas and CREZ zones, and how that's been able to integrate high amounts of wind energy throughout that. And we certainly believe that the Trump administration is committed to doing that as well in many other parts of the country today. But I think there's other ways to think about that as well. What we would call non-transmission alternatives or non-wires alternatives, things like energy storage that can meet that maybe there's a more cost-effective way of upgrading our infrastructure system and modernizing our grid, where perhaps you may want to invest in a battery. or a microgrid or some other type of technology that is going to allow for greater modernization in our infrastructure. That, at the end of the day, is pro-consumer. And there's other elements of that as well. Advanced metering infrastructure enables many smart grid technologies and energy efficiency technologies, among many other things, demand response, and thinking from it on that holistic level. And on top of that, we also think that regulatory frameworks, both at the state and federal level, they shouldn't be getting in the way of modernization. You see many states taking the lead on this. You can point to Texas, New York, Illinois, Pennsylvania, who already have an advanced system or looking at proposals to continue doing that. But ensuring as well at the federal level that FERC is not overseeing markets that have barriers to entry for a lot of technologies such as energy storage and distributed energy resources, as well as among many other advanced energy technologies. And at the end of the day, what all of these technologies are driving are economic growth in the United States. As an industry, the advanced energy industry is a $200 billion annual revenue industry and supports over 3 million jobs right here in the United States. That's tens of thousands of jobs, if not hundreds of thousands of jobs in every state in the US. And we really think that smart policy that incentivizes modernization and looking at how all technologies are able to compete among each other is really going to drive economic growth and, at the end of the day, drive down costs for consumers.
Thanks, Dylan. Please.
So Lisa, very pleased to be here, and thank you for inviting the American Gas Association to have a seat on this panel. I do believe that the topic of infrastructure is really what sets this country apart from any other country anywhere in the world. And it is really what makes America a superpower. It brings us the diversity that we need across our electrical system, across our gas systems, to meet all the energy needs that we have here in the United States. So very much appreciative of the topic of infrastructure at this conference. So what I'm representing here is the American Gas Association. We have over 200 natural gas utilities across the United States, of which we represent basically all of the publicly traded natural gas utilities in the United States that serves over 90% of the customers here in our country. It is a diverse group of people, and our main focus is to make sure that we have energy available to our customers every day, every season of the year, because as has been alluded to on this panel, energy is not consumed in a uniform manner. It ebbs and flows. I really like the way you describe the time that batteries crosses, because that's something that the natural gas industry has been doing for years. It does it with basically 4.7 TCF of natural gas storage. That's really what makes all of these systems work, because you store gas when it's basically not needed and you take it out when it is. The reason that is that there's 4 major appliances in the home, but if you look across the United States, it accounts for 50% of the energy consumption in an American's home. That is basically the furnace, the cooktop, the water heater, and the clothes dryer account for that 50%. We do very well what we do. We don't do everything that electricity does. The big difference, I think, between natural gas and some of the other fuel sources is natural gas is a very diversified source. So what I mean by that is about 30-some-odd% of it is actually used for power generation. You have about 33% or so that's used for industrial use, 17% is used for residential, 12% for commercial, and 3% for transportation. But more importantly, when you look at the market share for natural gas, you look at the fact that we have about 26% market share for gas power generation, and then approximately 40% of the market share for industrial, commercial, and residential use. And that's very, very important, because all of those different consumers or demand users use that for a little bit different types of purposes. And so, and then you had about 3% on transportation. I do think that LNG is a growing market. And so as we get into the conversation today, again, I kind of primarily talked about the end use piece, which is the distribution.
folks, but the real value is across the entire value chain that goes all the way back from the exploration and production community through the midstream, through the end user, which is the distribution unit. So we'll go ahead and get in the rest of the conversation. Thanks, Lisa.
Well, terrific overviews from all of you. I have many questions to follow up on each of your industry segments, but let's start with some general questions first. So here we are, we're across the street from the Capitol. We just heard from Trump administration leaders on energy and infrastructure policy. So I'd like to start, understanding, as they pointed out, that policymaking in the energy infrastructure arena is not just a federal affair. In fact, a lot of it is much more state-driven and sometimes locally oriented. But we are here in Washington. So I wanted to ask you, what is the federal government's role from your industry's standpoint on driving investment in infrastructure and modernization of our energy system? And, I'm going to mix it up a little bit just so we're not constantly going. Pierce, why don't we start with you? Let's start with you, Pierce, and then I'll keep you all on your toes to know who comes next.
So I think Secretary Zinke actually put this extremely well, is that the role of government is to basically hold the industry accountable to a certain standard. That's where you need to put in some rules and some regulations. And then, like he said, kind of get out of their way. Let them do what they do. Let them innovate. A good example is the natural gas industry actually got started back over 150 years ago by bringing natural gas into cities to light street lamps. Well, Edison came up with a light bulb and essentially put the natural gas business, under. But at the time, basically coal and wood was being used to heat homes. So that was an opportunity to innovate and build more infrastructure to actually bring the natural gas to people's homes. So that's the innovation that this industry can bring. So I think that's the role that they play, is the role of accountability and standards, and then the rest of it I think the industry takes care of, because this is an industry that is driven basically in the private sector. So you raise your debts, you raise your equity, but it's not burdening the taxpayer. So the entire American energy infrastructure has been built basically on the back of private money. And to give you a kind of a scope of that, there's 2.5 million miles of pipeline here in the United States. There's almost as many miles of pipeline as there actually is paved roads here in the United States. All that was done with private money.
Pretty remarkable. All right, well, I've said I was going to mix it up, but I'm going to go to Dylan next. So.
All right. I'd say we'd probably look at it from two levels. There's probably the investment side of things, and as you were saying, the accountability side of things. So I think it's incredibly important for the federal government to play a role in ensuring that investments are able to take place, whether they're providing resources to states that are looking into regulatory frameworks. I think that's incredibly helpful. You've seen that in numerous policies where states look to the Department of Energy or other agencies as they're looking into new opportunities and ensuring that funding levels are there, as well as I know many folks in the room here today would agree with. But there's also the accountability side, and something that we're very engaged in. And I may steal an example that Jason was going to use. But one thing that we're very engaged in is working with FERC and ensuring that they're overseeing markets that allow for innovative technologies to get onto market and invest there. One example that we frequently talk about and think is a good example of how the accountability side of it, where innovative technologies aren't getting onto market or aren't getting compensated, is in Indiana, where one of the most advanced batteries was put onto the grid, was providing a service called frequency regulation, but wasn't getting properly compensated for it because of the rules within that market were written specifically around one type of energy storage, but not around this new lithium-ion type of battery. So the compensation that they weren't getting from that doesn't send a good market signal for further investment within energy storage technologies, as well as many other advanced energy technologies that could be doing this. So I think it's important from the federal level, and FERC has done this, and we believe will continue to do this, is saying that markets should not be precluding investments in advanced technologies and should be sending proper investment signals for companies on that lens.
Thank you. Charlie, let's go to you next, and Jason will close that out.
All right.
Yeah.
Sure. So similar to the previous comments, and then I'll talk a little bit about how I think it's different as well. From a similarity standpoint, the accountability that we as an LNG, as the LNG industry have, especially within FERC, and then on the commercial side at DOE. But FERC really is sort of the primary authorizing agency for an LNG facility, and then there's obviously the local side of this, and where the facilities are sited and built. But from a FERC standpoint, they look at the operational plans, the design plans. And I think that a really good example of that accountability was just recently in the wake of Harvey, unfortunately, the devastation that happened in that area. But if you look at sort of the facilities that are under construction, and then Cheniere's facility, which is operational, the only reason the facility had to stop operation during that storm, during the hurricane, was related to the fact that vessels couldn't get in to load. It was literally Mother Nature preventing it, not from any sort of operational issues that the facility had. And that really speaks to the level of engagement and responsibility that FERC places on facility operators when they're designing these sites and thinking through from a disaster standpoint and a risk mitigation standpoint, that places the onus on the facility to make sure that they're going to operate safely and reliably. And then I think the other sort of piece of this, and where we're a little bit different, is from a commercial standpoint. Again, not dissimilar to Pierce's comments, all the facilities that are being built are through private investment. So LNG facilities aren't funded from a federal government standpoint. They're funded through private investment. And so there's some similarities there. But then DOE also has the approval for a commercial export of LNG. And so when DOE looks at this from a commercial export standpoint, they're looking at this from a public interest standpoint and making sure that exports of natural gas are in the good of the public interest, and making sure that those facilities aren't taking gas away from U.S. manufacturing or taking it away from home before we start putting it out into the world for consumption. So I think that there's a balancing act there. I think that the oversight that those two agencies provide in authorizing ensures that once permitted, that a facility can operate and signal also, more importantly, internationally, that they've gone through the necessary steps here and that we do have a predictable regulatory approval process to ensure that over the long term and in the life cycle of those facilities, 20 plus years of operation, that they can expect that if they put an order into a facility for LNG, that it's going to show up when it's expected to show up. We're not going to have sort of unnecessary shutdowns due to regulatory withdrawals or revocations of permits. So I think that that's a really important differentiation, that those facilities are the endpoint for use here in the United States, but the buyers are relying on that gas to show up when it's supposed to show up at that time. And knowing that our regulatory process ensures that that's going to happen is incredibly important to buyers.
Thank you. Jason.
Sure. So I think particularly when we talk about advanced energy technologies, like, for example, battery energy storage, a lot of this is new and is not in the planning that is conventionally conducted by states, by municipalities, by oftentimes utilities or munis or co-ops. And so a large part of this has to do with what capacity folks have to actually include this in a reasonable way in their planning. So, obviously in terms of the federal government's role, I think the Department of Energy, particularly through its grid modernization cross-cutting initiatives, has quite a lot of expertise to lend to states and utilities, munis, and co-ops. And really, this is not about telling folks what to do. This is about saying, particularly for smaller utilities, munis, and co-ops that may be constrained in human resources, just have a lot of priorities and not a ton of staff, who may be constrained from raising capital, particularly munis and co-ops, for whom their ratepayers are their capital as opposed to an investor-owned utility. You really have these questions about, well, even if I'm interested in this, do I actually have the capacity to go figure out how to do this and make it make sense in a long-term cost-benefit manner? And so that kind of assistance from the federal government to the states, to these small utilities, munis, and co-ops, I think is really critical for driving this innovation and the modernization of our electric infrastructure. And that's something that I think you're actually seeing even folks take up right now. If I'm not mistaken, on Friday, Senators Franken and Heinrich just introduced the Advancing Grid Storage Act of 2017, which is predicated on precisely helping give these states, smaller utilities, munis, and co-ops support if they choose this is something that they want to actually put into their planning in a cost-effective manner. The second thing, which certainly Dylan mentioned here, is getting rid of regulatory barriers to these advanced technologies to participate in our electric grid. I think he referenced the proposed rule in front of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission right now that would, in its proposed form, just say, create a means for participation in the markets for energy storage and for distributed energy resources. This is not anything other than, hey, this entire system was designed before you existed. Sorry that we don't have rules that are specific to you. Maybe we should do that now and make sure that there's actually the widest range of competitive resources to ensure the least cost provision of that service to every household and business in the country that's in these wholesale markets. And I think that that's something, certainly we've heard lots of folks on both sides of the aisle say this makes sense. Competition is going to be important for the American business and homeowner in terms of their electricity costs. But that's also in physical access, not just those, but the proposed rule on interconnection standards right now would similarly reduce barriers to interconnecting energy storage to the electric grid. Again, something that just all those rules and processes were designed before you had these large-scale transmission-connected battery storage assets coming in. So we need to come up with rules that actually get rid of the barriers to them right now. And then finally, and I think this is something that, in the report Secretary Perry ordered, the staff report on electric grid reliability, really talked to this concept of we need to have some sort of measure of and value for resilience if this is something that we think is missing from the electric system. And so I think there's something to be said about that. If we want to really actually take account of the resilience, the importance of resilience in our energy infrastructure, how are high-cost, low-probability events actually being figured into that? There's not actually an established method for doing that, which means there's not an economic logic that you base it on that can be sort of standardized and regularized. And I think that's something that certainly, particularly from the energy storage industry standpoint, we would agree is absolutely something that you could go do that would be of value and importance. And there's 2 points to that. One is certainly that you want to make sure that these are things that actually get priced. In fact, in front of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission right now is another proposed rule that would require an essential reliability service, primary frequency response, to be required to be made available as a condition of interconnection, so unpriced. Well, this seems like a basic point where you could say, well, that's an essential reliability service. DOE has just said in their reliability report that we should price essential reliability services. Maybe that's something we should turn into an actual competitive market. But also the second is just look at southern Florida and Texas, look at Puerto Rico. How do we decide what should be in that infrastructure given the threat matrix of disasters and extreme events? There's not an economic logic for us to work with here other than a sense of now this is a horrible tragedy unfolding before our very eyes. And, Secretary Perry talks about, I wish we could put a SMR on the back of a C-117 and just fly it in so we have the generation. And actually, I think nuclear subs could do short of power. But the fact of the matter is, you don't have any wires. And so you get that generating asset there. Right now, we're just sending diesel and diesel gen sets there because you need to have the power locally. And at the same time, Puerto Rico's awash in a free fuel source called the sun. And you could think that even just for critical facilities, to keep refrigeration running for medicines and things like that, we might think in fuel supply constrained areas that this is something we should take account of when we talk about our planning for resilience.
Well, you launched into the next conversation I wanted to have, which was about resiliency. This is not a new concept. Yes, and it was, the title of the report as released was Reliability and Resiliency. So when the Department of Energy released the study on our grid infrastructure and energy system, they purposefully put in the word resiliency, and that was before these horrible storms of the last month. And so I'm wondering if we've hit a turning point on the term resiliency, and that we're going to drive more action in terms of either pricing mechanisms or policies or market rules that value resiliency. But I mean, resiliency is a very broad term. Every industry could define it in its own way. I mean, maybe we can hear just briefly from the natural gas side how you're looking at the question of resiliency and what you provide, and then maybe Dylan, you could close it out with a more general view. I'm mindful of the clock. I wanted to ask one more question, and then I'm going to go to the audience. So please get ready with your questions. Thanks.
Okay, so Lisa, I think you really hit the key word there, which is, how does resiliency bring value? And I want to give you two examples from our particular service territory. One being the Port Arthur and basically the Texas service territories. There's a large grocery chain that exists down in Texas. It's called HEB. And over the last several years, they have decided into some of their very critical stores or larger stores that they're going to put in backup generation. So they built it basically outside of their grocery stores. They put it up out of the flood plains and flood zones, those kind of things. And it's backup generation. It's served by natural gas, and throughout all of these storms that happen, I think out of all the places that they had these things installed, there was only two that they did not use there, and it's because the whole area kind of got flooded, and so they had to shut down the grocery stores anyway. But all the rest of the places, they were able to keep all the food preserved, and then the minute that kind of life resurfaced again after the storm exited, then all the citizens in that area had access to food. That was not the case in previous hurricanes. Another example I have is the University of Texas there in Galveston. They have a medical center, and we went through basically a 3 to 4 year planning process after Ike of what was called hardening, where we actually laid some additional lines into the city or into that particular area of the hospital, had it at a higher pressure. So these pipelines are anywhere from 3 to 6 feet underground. So the water that's over them really doesn't do anything to them. You elevate some of the equipment that's water sensitive, regulators, relief valves, those kind of things. And then basically through this last hurricane, so this was after Ike, through the last hurricane that just came through with Harvey, that hospital never missed a beat. And what's important about that is the hospital realized that has a value to them. So from a expenditure standpoint, they may have had research going on there at the hospital. It may have gone on for years. Well, if you lose the power, then you lose all of that research. And so they realize that there's value for research, there's value in human life, there's value in not having to transport sick people to other places. So this concept of resiliency is real. And natural gas is really one of the easiest answers to the resiliency issue.
Charlie, did you have anything you wanted to add?
The only thing I would add is just from you talked a little bit about what's the government doing to try to help with that resiliency, and I think that the Caribbean is a great place to point to for natural gas, and we're starting to see it happen, and we actually saw some action 2 weeks ago at the Department of Energy announcing a notice of proposed rulemaking to help expedite small-scale LNG, which is very small volumes of LNG exported out of the U.S. down to the Caribbean. And I think that, right now, obviously, Jason made the point, there are no lines to move that electricity around. However, the ability to get gas to those countries that are in need of it and sourcing the electric facilities right next to where they're bringing that gas in is a new concept and something new to those islands. And it's not something they traditionally had access to natural gas. And so when you see the administration taking steps to try to speed that along, because we're not talking about bringing the big cargo vessels that haul LNG typically around the world into Caribbean islands. They don't have the ports and the infrastructure to support that. But responding to demand and opportunity in those markets that are in desperate need of it, quite frankly, the administration taking steps to try to alleviate some of the permitting process to get that gas there.
Thanks. Dylan, any close out this conversation, which will, again, be something we'll be talking about for a number of years, I'm sure.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I'll go quickly, but I think the conversation in DC so far, when it's been focused on reliability and resilience, seems to be focusing on that only a few number of technologies can provide reliability and resilience benefits. What we would say is, let's not get technology specific, and let's say that any of these technologies, if they can provide those services, let them compete to do so, and would very clearly say that advanced energy is a part of that. We've been talking about severe weather events, and I think that is a showcasing of how advanced energy can do that. For example, during Superstorm Sandy, when generators were going down and everything, critical assets like hospitals were staying open because they had distributed energy resources. They had combined heat and power. They had many other resources on site that were able to keep them available. Same thing in Hurricane Harvey just recently, saw many resources going down, but wind energy was right back online as soon as that storm was out there and was the first to kick back online. So there are benefits there. And we hear this referenced very often, just earlier this morning, around the polar vortex, and that there were resources going down because it was so cold. But advanced energy doesn't get its day. Oftentimes when talked about in the polar vortex, you can read the grid assessment report, but when the inside of my brother-in-law's car was freezing because it was so cold in Chicago, there were many technical failures and many, frankly, coal plants or coal piles were freezing, natural gas pipelines were freezing. The PJM assessment was that wind energy and demand response helped keep the lights on. And that is what the assessment was. So if we're talking about the polar vortex or other severe weather events and how we can have reliability and resilience benefits, advanced energy is a part of that conversation and is already providing those benefits today.
So my last kind of rapid fire question for you is, okay, so we're hearing these wonderful examples of how a diverse portfolio is working together to solve some of these very very close challenges we've just faced post-storm, or, how they're serving communities. And so they're wonderful examples, they're proliferating, but they aren't the mainstream in all parts of the country. What are the biggest barriers your industry faces to scale up that kind of activity from your industry's perspective? And who wants to go first? Charlie?
I'm probably the
Okay.
briefest answer, because we're not trying to expand to mainstream. Quite frankly, I mean, we're not looking to try to bring LNG across the United States. We're looking to try to bring LNG to other countries that are in demand for gas. I think that the biggest barrier for the U.S. LNG industry right now is the regulatory approval process. And so if we can manage that and get that to a little bit more of a manageable process as far as how long it takes to get these projects approved, I think we'll be able to respond to the coming demand that we're seeing signs of starting to develop around the world. So I think that if we can get the regulatory process to a manageable pace, I think that we would be well served to respond to the demand.
Great.
Again, informational barriers with new things, unclear, don't necessarily know how to deal with it for the first time. So that assistance on planning, on learning by doing, getting over those informational barriers so you know how to use it and how to value it. Similarly, having the means to value these things, whether that's through resilience, whether that's through being able to participate in existing markets, I think is critical so that folks who are investing this can figure out how the dollars and cents add up.
Yeah, and just quickly, I think on the informational side of things, ensuring that decision makers, policymakers, legislators understand that the idea that the industry is somehow 5 or 10 years out from providing valuable services is just not true. As I mentioned, this is a $200 billion industry employing or supporting more than 3 million workers. This is here today. It's providing valuable resources into the grid. And we need to kind of get over that mental hurdle as if these technologies aren't here today, or if it's a nascent industry that will be out there. That it's here today, and we need to ensure that federal policy isn't blocking technologies from getting on the grid.
So the utility industry is right around $1 trillion worth of market cap. So it is a very established, it's something that attracts capital both on the debt and the equity side. So the funding is not the issue. The issue is actually regulatory process. There are so many different regulatory agencies that weigh in on the building of a pipeline. that there is not, in our opinion, enough coordination across those. And so whether or not that's a restructuring, whether or not it's a cultural issue, whether or not it's a process issue, one or all of those three need to be addressed.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. We'd love to go to the audience for a couple of questions, if we have any. Please raise your hand. And if you could, just please introduce yourself.
Good morning. My name is Emily Reichert, and I run Greentown Labs, a large technology incubator. I'm obviously interested in new technology, getting new technology onto the grid. And I'm curious what's happened to Puerto Rico and Texas and other places, but especially Puerto Rico. Right now we're dealing obviously with a humanitarian crisis. But is anyone seeing this as an opportunity to take what is now kind of a destroyed grid and a system that didn't work and was able to be destroyed, to really think through what should we be doing on an island, rather than bringing diesel to generators and trying to get that to work logistically? How could we make this island more independent and redesign the grid going forward, if you could do it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, let's just, after Hurricane Superstorm Sandy hit New York, that was a real big reason why New York said, hold on, we need to do things a little differently here, which is part of what's driving the distributed energy resource conversation there. And I think that you could certainly take that discussion to a place like Puerto Rico as well, particularly because being an island, it doesn't have the benefits of connecting to our larger grid and may have some supply chain constraints in these kinds of events. Fundamentally, I think that creating a 21st century electric system, first we need to focus on helping people not die. And I think getting, whether it's containers of LNG and diesel for gensets, or mobile deployable solar storage or whatever, that's what matters right now. And I really hope that that's where the federal government focuses, and we can think about the questions of the rebuild once we've done that. But I think that when it comes to that conversation, there's a lot of things to discuss, and the DOE has a lot of expertise in having thought through these grid architectures and what a future grid might look like.
Thank you. Let me see if there's any other questions. Yes.
Jared, well, I'm chair of the Environmental Energy Study Institute. Great panel. The issues are we agree we have materials. Thank you. There's an agreement that we have the technology, we have the materials to create this advanced energy economy, and energy storage, et cetera. But my question is in terms of workforce and technology education. I mean, are we too far ahead of the ability of the workforce to find out how to use this intelligently, install it, and maintain it?
Good question. Anybody want to tackle that one?
Yeah, great question. No, I don't think so. I think that's certainly a challenge. I think we've been working very closely in California. Our outfit there, working and making sure workforce development is happening. But I think there are great examples, such as Michigan right now. We have a great company that has talked about this and how Michigan has been very much investing in renewable energy generation and expanded that as policies have supported that. And some of the innovative work they've been doing is companies going directly to community colleges and local universities there to work on workforce development to ensure that as turbine technology has improved over the last 10 years even, ensuring that students coming in the workforce right now or folks trying to make transitions are able to do that as well. So I think this is one where there's a very smart way where industry and educational institutions can work together to ensure that, and making sure that the policy is right there to make sure. So I think there are highlights to say that we are meeting that.
Is this something that the industry groups can go back to the administration, whatever administration it is, to encourage funding and incentivization for universities to create these kind of treatments? I see it very much a problem right now.
Yeah, I think I do think people are already trying to focus on that in last year's energy bill, which didn't get across the line. But I know that Congress was very interested in ensuring that there is that 21st century energy workforce, and this is an issue that I think many in Congress and the administration are pursuing.
Well, I think I'm going to take the opportunity to close the panel. We've had an excellent discussion, and we have another panel, a couple more panels this afternoon, so I hope that everybody will stay. We also have some amazing speakers and a wonderful lunch program. But, just to kind of wrap out some of the themes I think I'm taking away from this, clearly we have an abundance and a growing new set of technologies to bring to the challenges that we face. We've heard some really strong examples of how, in response to the recent storms, it's just been an opportunity to showcase how this integrated set of technologies is working to help communities and get our businesses back up and running. So it's a really exciting and dynamic time across the whole spectrum of energy resources. There clearly is a role for the federal government here, while we understand that there's a lot of critical policy making at the state, regional, and local level. I mean, we're just going to reemphasize what we heard from this morning, this idea of the federal government setting standards and being an accountability mechanism to ensure that there are, non-discriminatory market rules that are in place. So these new technologies have an opportunity to work in concert to solve the needs and improve our infrastructure. I think regulatory reform, and we clearly heard that strongly from both Secretary Perry and Secretary Zinke, and we've heard it from the panelists. And so there's a real appetite to get that moving with this administration. So I think it's up to all of us to work together to provide the industry perspective, which is so critical to ensuring that we have cost-effective action and that it's durable, sustained progress for our economy. So thank you all, and thank you again to CREZ for the opportunity to moderate this panel. I'm going to give you some applause.
Cheers.